Cutting taxes is popular. Finding the money to pay for those cuts is considerably more difficult. Within days of entering Downing Street, Prime Minister Andy Burnham announced a series of measures intended to reduce the cost of living and support local businesses. VAT would be removed from domestic electricity bills, bus fares would be capped at £2, and pubs, social clubs, and live music venues would receive a reduction in their business rates. Each announcement was designed to send the same political message. Burnham's government intended to act quickly and put money back into the pockets of households and businesses. But government finances do not operate like a bottomless account. When a tax is cut, revenue is lost. When a fare is subsidised, government spending increases. And when ministers promise that a policy is fully funded, the obvious question is this: where is the money actually coming from? The first major measure was the removal of VAT from domestic electricity bills. From the 1st of October 2026, the VAT rate on household electricity is scheduled to fall from 5% to 0 for the remainder of the financial year. The Treasury estimates that the measure will cost approximately £850 million in 2026 to 2027. The government says that removing the tax will reduce the annualised Ofgem electricity price cap by approximately £45. However, because the reduction initially applies for only 6 months, the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates that the average household on the price cap will actually save closer to £25 during that period. The second announcement was a £2 cap on eligible single bus journeys in England outside London. The cap will run from January until December 2027 and replace the existing £3 limit. Unlike the electricity measure, this is not a tax cut. It is a government subsidy intended to compensate bus operators for charging passengers less. The scheme is supported by £400 million of additional funding, with the wider package rising to £454 million when funding for devolved governments is included. The third announcement was a 20% reduction in business rates for pubs, social clubs, and live music venues in England. The government says nearly 32,000 venues will benefit, with a typical pub saving approximately £1,100 during the next financial year. The package is expected to cost around £100 million each year. Individually, these policies may appear relatively modest compared with the total size of the British economy, but they illustrate one of the most important questions in politics. When a government promises to make something cheaper, somebody still has to absorb the cost. So, who is paying for Andy Burnham's tax cuts? The government's main answer for the electricity tax cut is the cancellation of the previous digital ID programme. That programme has been expected to cost around £1.8 billion over 3 years. By cancelling it, Burnham argues that the government can redirect those resources towards reducing electricity bills. On the surface, the arithmetic appears simple. Cancel a programme worth £1.8 billion, use £850 million of the savings to finance a temporary tax cut, and still have money left over. But public spending is rarely that straightforward. The digital ID programme did not necessarily have £1.8 billion sitting untouched inside a separate bank account. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it had originally been expected to be financed through future reductions and reprioritisation elsewhere in departmental budgets. In other words, much of the money had not yet been saved. The government was planning to find those savings later. Cancelling digital ID removes a future spending commitment, but ministers must still identify approximately £850 million of actual reductions elsewhere in departmental budgets to finance the electricity VAT cut this year. This distinction matters. There is a difference between cancelling spending that has already been fully funded and cancelling a programme that itself depended on savings that had not yet been specified. Imagine that somebody plans to buy a car next year for £20,000. They have not yet saved the money, but they expect to pay for it by reducing their other spending. If they cancel the car and announce that they will instead spend £10,000 renovating their house, they have not automatically discovered £10,000 in cash. they must still make the spending reductions that were supposed to pay for the car. That is broadly the criticism being made of the digital ID calculation. The government can reasonably argue that cancelling the programme creates room within its future plans. But critics can also reasonably ask which departmental budgets will now be reduced to turn that theoretical room into real savings. There is another problem. The electricity VAT reduction is initially temporary. It is scheduled to last from October 2026 until the beginning of April 2027. If the government restores the 5% tax after 6 months, the policy remains a short-term intervention. But temporary tax cuts can become politically difficult to reverse. Once households become accustomed to paying less, restoring the tax can be portrayed as increasing their bills. The IFS has warned that cancelling digital ID cannot finance a permanent electricity tax cut indefinitely. Much of the digital ID spending would have involved the initial cost of creating the system. Once those one-off savings have been used, a permanent tax reduction would require a permanent source of funding. That means Burnham may have financed the first 6 months, but he has not yet explained how a permanent electricity VAT cut would be paid for beyond April 2027. That decision has been left for the budget. The bus fare cap uses a different form of funding. The government says it will reprioritise money from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Part of the funding previously intended for international climate projects will be changed from grants into loans. This allows money to be redirected towards domestic transport, while the government argues that overseas climate support can continue in a different form. But this is still a political choice. A grant provides money that does not need to be repaid. A loan eventually must be repaid and may therefore be less attractive or accessible to the country or project receiving it. The £2 bus cap is not being financed by newly discovered money. It is being financed by changing how existing money is used. Supporters will argue that this is exactly what a new government should do. Governments inherit spending plans from their predecessors and are entitled to change the priorities. Burnham believes that reducing everyday transport costs in Britain should take precedence over using the same money for international climate grants. Critics may respond that this does not eliminate the cost. It transfers the cost from one policy area to another. British bus passengers benefit, while part of the overseas climate programme receives loans instead of grants. The business rates reduction for pubs, clubs and music venues is also supposed to be funded through changes elsewhere in the tax system. The government says it will review reliefs given to businesses that it believes make a limited contribution to local communities, including some vape shops. It also plans to improve the collection of VAT from sellers using online marketplaces who are not complying with their tax obligations. The principle is understandable. Reduce taxes for businesses that strengthen high streets and community life, recover more money from businesses that avoid tax or receive relief the government no longer considers justified. But enforcement income is not always predictable. A government may estimate that a crackdown will raise a particular amount. The actual revenue depends on how much avoidance exists, how quickly the new system can be introduced, and how businesses change their behaviour. The government describes the £100 million package as fully funded. However, the complete calculations behind the expected revenue have not yet been published in detail. Further information is expected through consultations and the budget. This does not prove that the policy is unfunded, but it does mean that the public currently has a promise of full funding rather than a complete set of figures demonstrating exactly how every pound will be raised. There is also the question of who has been excluded. Pubs, social clubs and live music venues will receive support. Restaurants and hotels will not receive the same reduction despite arguing that they face similar pressures. UK hospitality has warned that other parts of the sector continue to struggle with rising costs and business rate increases. Tax policy inevitably creates boundaries. Once one type of business receives relief, similar businesses will ask why they have been left outside it. The initial policy may therefore become the beginning of a much more expensive demand for wider support. Behind all these announcements lies a basic economic reality. The government has only a limited number of ways to pay for tax cuts or additional spending. It can reduce spending elsewhere, it can increase other taxes, it can borrow more money, or it can hope that stronger economic growth eventually generates additional tax revenue. Burnham's early announcements rely mainly on the first two approaches. The electricity reduction depends on departmental savings linked to cancelling digital ID. The bus cap depends on redirecting money from international climate finance. The business rates cut depends on removing other reliefs and improving tax collection. In each case, one group benefits because the government changes what happens somewhere else. There is no free money. There are only different choices about where money should come from and where it should go. Borrowing offers another possibility, but Burnham and Chancellor John Healey have promised to follow the government's fiscal rules. Those rules require routine day-to-day spending to be financed from revenue rather than borrowing, while debt must fall as a proportion of the economy within the forecast period. Britain also faces high debt interest costs and significant pressure from defence, welfare, health and social care spending. That leaves economic growth. A successful tax cut may support spending, investment or employment. A pub that saves money on business rates may invest, employ another worker or avoid closure. Lower bus fares may help people reach work and education. Cheaper electricity may leave households with slightly more money to spend elsewhere. But growth cannot be treated as guaranteed funding before it occurs. Governments often claim that a policy will eventually pay for itself. In reality, some policies produce additional growth, some produce only a limited effect, and others cost considerably more than the revenue they generate. So, how is Andy Burnham paying for his tax cuts? The answer is that some of the money has been identified, but not every question has been resolved. The temporary electricity VAT cut is officially linked to cancelling digital ID, although the IFS argues that the underlying departmental savings still need to be found. The bus fare cap is being financed by redirecting energy and climate funding. The business rates reduction is intended to be funded through fewer reliefs elsewhere and stronger tax enforcement, although the detailed calculations remain incomplete. For the immediate measures, Burnham has presented a plausible route to funding. For permanent tax cuts, he still faces the same choices as every Prime Minister: reduce spending, raise taxes somewhere else, borrow more, or produce enough growth to expand the economy and the tax base. The first announcements have shown where Andy Burnham wants to spend political capital. The budget will reveal whether the financial capital is really there. If you found this explanation useful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the Nelson Brief. Let me know in the comments whether you believe these tax cuts are properly funded or whether difficult decisions have simply been postponed until the budget. This has been the Nelson Brief, the context behind the story.